A new report reveals the identity of the activists who protested outside of the homes of several Supreme Court justices. Writing in the Daily Wire, Mary Margaret Olohan says the demonstrators have ties to communist groups as well as Black Lives Matter. Laws in both Virginia and Maryland prohibit protests at the residence of an individual to disrupt or threaten the person's, quote, tranquility in their home. Mary Margaret Olohan, D.C. correspondent for the Daily Wire, joins us now. Mary Margaret, great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. So tell us a little bit more about this report.
Yeah, so we decided to take a look at a couple of these activists who have been protesting since May, basically, outside the homes of the Supreme Court justices. And just to put that in perspective, in May, after the Dobbs opinion leaked, these protesters came out to kind of prove to the justices, we're going to intimidate you into changing your mind so that you will not overturn Roe v. Wade. And they were very frank about that. They were protesting. They were saying all kinds of horrible things. They were swearing and nightly protests outside the homes of the justices. And like you said, Maryland and Virginia law prohibits these people from disturbing the tranquility of the justices in their neighborhood, and yet authorities haven't done anything about it. So then we saw in June Roe v. Wade was overturned, and yet these activists are still out protesting, specifically protesting at the homes of Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh and of course other justices. But as we're heading, back into the school season, Amy Coney Barrett's kids are going to school, the Kavanaugh kids are going to school. It's disturbing to see these protests continue. And we know that a man traveled across the country with the stated intent to kill Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And again, officials are doing nothing about it. It's just mind-boggling. So we took a look at a couple of these guys. For example, Nadine, she's been really involved in Black Lives Matter for a long time. She would camp out outside the Black Lives Matter fence with all the pictures on it back in 2017. She would literally sleep there. We've got Sansara. She is part of the RevComms, which is the communist group that spends all their time kind of jumping onto these other movements, and they've been accused of kind of hijacking these social justice movements to fit their own purposes. And then you got Sadie, Sadie loves to go to Amy Coney Barrett's house with her activist pals, and they kind of wave bubbles around, they chant these rude things, and they'll talk about handmaids. And they're very active on social media talking about their friend groups that they formed, protesting outside of Barrett's home. And so these are just a couple of the activists that have been doing this. And we thought, why not shine a spotlight on them and show who's out there and, what's going on.
Yeah, very interesting report. Anything else that you found out that really surprised you?
Well, I mean, if you take a look at this kind of things that these guys are posting, it's kind of weird because Roe v. Wade has been overturned, right? But in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned, they're still out there. They still want to bother the justices. And so they're basically just criticizing the justices over and over and saying rude things. And one interesting thing we found was that the RevComms, this communist group that kind of infiltrates all these other pro-abortion groups and activist causes as of late, they were really involved in getting Rise Up for Abortion Rights started, which is this group that you never heard of before January because they didn't exist. Well, they got started this spring and were probably the most obvious group at the Supreme Court during these protests when Roe was overturned. Rise Up for Abortion Rights, they were dressed in green. One of their guys climbed up on a bridge in D.C. and stayed up there to protest the overturn of Roe. They're very just kind of alarmist and activist in their tactics. They chain themselves to the Supreme Court fencing. And these guys are not very well liked by the other pro-abortion groups. That was something I thought that was interesting, that when we were digging into this story, they're not very well liked. And people have noticed that their tactics are embarrassing for these other pro-abortion groups. They don't like it.
Yeah, it's very interesting, all the stuff that you've unearthed. I know there was also a study that came out this summer saying that about 60% of Americans want the Justice Department to crack down on those protests outside of homes. What more can you tell us about that? Is anything being done?
Yeah, so this polling done by Judicial Crisis Network, it's really interesting because if that large of a quantity of Americans want the Justice Department to take action to protect the Supreme Court justices, you would think that the Justice Department at least would have exerted itself more to protect the justices. And yet we're seeing little to no action from the Justice Department on this. Now I've been told by different officials that I've reached out to that they're investigating different acts of alleged domestic terrorism against pro-life centers and clinics. But still, we've seen no direct action on this from the Justice Department when we know that Merrick Garland had no scruples in investigating the parents who were saying that they had problems with these progressive school boards teaching really radical concepts to their kids.
Yeah, another thing I want to talk about, speaking of radical concepts, this hidden video that came out about a Connecticut teacher, I think assistant principal up in Connecticut, I believe it's around the Greenwich area.
Yes,
so basically saying, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, they don't hire Catholics. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Pretty shocking.
Yes, and it is a blatant example of anti-Catholic bigotry. And, you know, I think many Catholics who have experienced this kind of thing, we will talk about it and call it out and say that's anti-Catholic bigotry. And I've heard many in the media kind of scoff at that and say, oh, no, that doesn't exist. You're making that up. This is a very clear-cut example of anti-Catholic bigotry where this school official literally admits Catholics know what they want, they know what they believe, and they're not going to change their mind, and they're not easily influenced. And so he was saying, I don't want to hire them because they're not going to subject themselves to our ideological persuasions. And I think that it's a bravo to Project Veritas for exposing this video and showing the people what an anti-Catholic attitude that is and that it truly does exist.
Yeah, it does exist, and we're so glad that they brought that to light. And thank you for all that you're doing. We appreciate it, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you.